Long before America, long before Europe, long before kings carved their names into stone, slavery already existed. The oldest clay tablets ever found describe human beings taken as property. Some of the earliest stories in the Bible begin with people in chains under Pharaoh. And the Quran speaks of captives seized in war. The Indian Vedas divide humans into castes at birth. Some are destined for service, others destined for power. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the farms of ancient China and to the Viking coastal raids, every civilization on earth enslaved someone. Every race, every empire, every person alive today descends from someone who survived it. Yet in the modern world, we are told only one chapter matters. Only one people suffered. Only one story deserves to be remembered, while all the others are erased. But the real music history, the full history, is older, deeper, and far more uncomfortable than the versions we are allowed to discuss. So if every race was enslaved, if every empire practiced it, and if entire nations still live with the legacy today, then why are we only taught one story? Who decides whose suffering counts more? And what are they trying to hide by keeping the rest forgotten? Let's try and find out. Hello, I'm Mike Drawberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker. And on today's episode of Forgotten History, we will try to answer these questions. Slavery began the moment the first human tribes learned they could force another group to work for them. The oldest clay tablets on Earth, from ancient Mesopotamia 4,000 years before Christ, already contain laws regulating slaves, debt, and captives taken in war. By the time humans learned to write, slavery was already old. In Egypt, long before Moses was ever born, foreign captives were marched into quarries and mines, used to build the wealth of pharaohs who believed their power came from the gods themselves. Across the Indus Valley, in the early kingdoms of India, the ancient Indian Vedas described rigid social divisions that would eventually harden into the caste system. Entire families were locked into service roles from birth, their children inheriting the same fate, with no chance to rise. In China's Shang and Zhou dynasties, war captives and criminals were branded, bought, sold, and passed down as property. Entire households could be enslaved for generations, their names stripped away and replaced with the identity of their owners. Sound familiar? In Greece, slaves worked the silver mines of Laurion under conditions so brutal most never lived long enough to see freedom. And in Rome itself, a third of Italy's population was enslaved at the height of the empire. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Jews, anyone conquered by Roman legions could be marched home in chains. And also in Rome, as in many ancient societies, the children of slaves were automatically born slaves as well. Across Africa, long before European ships ever appeared, powerful kingdoms took captives from rival tribes, sometimes for labor, sometimes for human sacrifice, and sometimes for trade. Slavery wasn't foreign to Africa before the Europeans. It was woven into the political and economic fabric of the region. And in the Middle East, the rise of Islam did not erase slavery. It regulated it. Quranic verses speak directly about the treatment of captives, the rights of slaves, and the conditions for manumission. The Arab slave trade would last more than 1,000 years, moving millions of Africans, Persians, Slavs, Greeks, and others across vast distances. Music. In the Americas, long before Columbus, many native tribes took captives in war. Some were adopted, some were traded, some were tortured, and some became hereditary slaves inside the tribe that conquered them. Every corner of the earth has its own version of this story. Every civilization its own record of who wore the chains and who held them. Slavery wasn't invented by the West. It wasn't created by the Europeans. And it wasn't limited to any one race. By the time the first European ship crossed the Atlantic, slavery had already existed for thousands of years. and nearly every human society on the planet had participated in it. Slavery didn't just survive after the ancient world. It became an industry. And before the Atlantic trade ever existed, the largest slave systems on Earth were already fully operational. We begin in the marshlands of southern Iraq in the year 869 AD. 500,000 African slaves, the Zanji, rose up against the Abbasid Caliphate in one of the largest slave rebellions in human history. These men were brought from East Africa to the plantations around Basra, harvesting sugarcane under conditions so brutal that most didn't survive more than a few years. Their revolt lasted 14 years. Entire cities were destroyed. Tens of thousands died. And when the rebellion was finally crushed in 883, the slave trade continued as if nothing had happened at all. Under the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Fatimids in Cairo, and later the Sultans of Zanzibar, slaves flowed across the Indian Ocean world. Men from Nubia and Abyssinia, women from the Swahili coast, and boys taken from the Horn of Africa to be castrated, eunuchs sold for 20 times the price of an ordinary slave. Markets in Zanzibar, Muscat, and Cairo moved human beings in numbers the world wouldn't see again until the rise of the Atlantic system. From the Indian Ocean, we shift north into the Mediterranean world between the 900s and 1400s, where the word slave itself was born. Slavic villagers were routinely captured by the Pechenegs, the Cumans, and the Khazars, powerful nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who ruled the vast plains north of the Black Sea, and whose captives were funneled into the slave markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Shia Middle East. Genoese merchants operating out of Kaffa in Crimea exported more than 10,000 slaves a year at their peak. Mamluk traders bought Circassian and Georgian boys for the armies of Egypt. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad of Egypt filled his ranks with warriors purchased from Khan Uz Beg of the Mongol Golden Horde. These boys taken from the Black Sea region would later form the backbone of Egypt's military elite. And it was the same in Central and West Africa long before the first European ship appeared on the coast. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in present-day Benin under King Agaja and later King Gizo, built its entire political structure around slave raiding. Dahomey exported 8 to 10,000 captives per year through the port of Oida. And the Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana, founded by Ose Tutu, turned victories over Denkyira and other rivals into a steady supply of war captives sold through Kumasi. The Oyoko Council approved annual military campaigns specifically to produce slaves for export. In the Kingdom of Congo, King Afonso I wrote letters to Portugal in the early 1500s describing entire villages being emptied by neighboring Ndongo in search of captives. Studies estimate that before the Europeans entered the market, between 12 and 14% of West Africa's total population lived in some form of servitude. These weren't small tribal practices. They were state-level systems. And across the Atlantic, similar systems were operating long before Columbus. Among the native tribes of the Haida and the Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest, roughly a quarter of all households held slaves captured from the New Cha-Nulth or the Coast Salish. In the American Southwest and Great Plains, the Comanche built a raiding empire that took thousands of Apache, Ute, Navajo, and even Mexican captives over the centuries. In central Mexico, the Aztec marketplace at Tlatelolco sold slaves as routinely as food. And in the Andes, the Inca forced the labor tax, mida, that required up to 30% of adult males to work for the empire in agriculture, mining, and construction. Slavery wasn't rare in the Americas. It was a normal part of life. Then came the Barbary States, the final brutal slave system before the Atlantic slave trade. From the 1500s to the 1800s, in the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, along with the Sultanate of Morocco, they unleashed corsair fleets across the Mediterranean under commanders like Uru and Hayreddin Barbarossa. They captured ships and raided European coastlines as far north as Iceland. The 1627 raid on Iceland alone captured 400 people, mostly women and children. In Algiers, between 25,000 and 35,000 slaves were held at any given time. Her music over the course of 3 centuries, an estimated 1 to 1.5 million Europeans were enslaved. Italians, Spaniards, Dutch, Greeks, Irish, and even Americans. And when the USS Philadelphia ran aground off Tripoli in 1803, its entire crew was enslaved. That single event triggered the First Barbary War under Thomas Jefferson, and then the Second Barbary War under James Madison. The first foreign wars in American history, fought not over land, but to stop the enslavement of American citizens. By the time Europeans arrived on the West African coast, the machinery of bondage was already everywhere. The world didn't discover slavery in the Atlantic. The Atlantic inherited it. The Atlantic slave trade didn't begin in a vacuum. It was built on top of a global system that had already existed for thousands of years. But what made the Atlantic version so powerful wasn't the concept of slavery itself. It was the world it collided with. For the first time in history, slavery entered an age of expanding navigation, oceanic commerce, and written bureaucracy. European nations didn't invent the slave ship, but they were the first to scale it globally. Portugal began purchasing captives from West African kingdoms in the 1440s. Spain, the Netherlands, France, and England followed. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, roughly 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. About 10.7 million survived the journey. But here's the part almost no one is ever taught: the vast majority didn't come to the United States. Nearly 5 million were sent to Brazil alone, almost half of the entire Atlantic slave trade. Another 4 million were taken to the Caribbean plantations under British, French, Spanish, and Dutch control. Spanish America absorbed more than 1 million. Only about 3 to 4%, roughly 388,000 people, were brought to what became the United States. So what was different about this form of slavery? It wasn't the brutality. It wasn't the scale. The Arab trade lasted longer and reached just as far. And it wasn't the idea that one group enslaved another. That was the story of the entire world. People say the Atlantic slave trade was all about race. But if it were truly based on race alone, something very simple would be true: there would never have been free black people. But there were thousands. From the 1600s onward, some bought their freedom. Some were born free. Some even owned land. And yes, some even owned slaves. In 1830, according to U.S. Census records, 775 free black slaveholders collectively owned 12,760 enslaved black people. And that reality tells us something the modern narrative leaves out: slavery followed the money first, the ideology second. If the goal had been racial purity, the system would have been airtight, no exceptions. But economics creates loopholes, and slavery was an economic engine. Freed black populations existed because the system wasn't built purely on skin color. It was built on supply, demand, labor needs, and most importantly, profit. And the second difference was time. The Atlantic system didn't end in the ancient world or the medieval world. It ended in 1865. That's only 6 or 7 generations ago. People alive today had great-grandparents who were born into slavery. That proximity makes the Atlantic story feel heavier, closer, and more personal. And the third difference was documentation. The Atlantic trade was recorded in ledgers, manifests, and newspapers. Earlier slave systems left scattered fragments. But the Atlantic trade left paperwork: names, numbers, ages, origins, and prices. It left records that allowed descendants to trace pain in a way no other civilization had permitted. So yes, the Atlantic slave trade was distinct in some ways, but not in the ways we're often told. It wasn't the only slave system. It wasn't the only hereditary system. It wasn't the only racialized system. Arab traders treated non-Muslims as an underclass for centuries, and it wasn't the largest system in terms of duration, reach, or total volume. It did not exist in a world untouched by slavery. It existed in a world shaped by it. For thousands of years, slavery moved through every civilization on Earth without interruption. Empires rose and fell, religions formed and split, borders shifted, languages died, but slavery remained. Her music, it survived in Rome. It survived the caliphates. It survived the Mongols, the Vikings, the kingdoms of Africa, the empires of the Americas. It survived everything humanity threw at it. And then, for the first time in recorded history, a civilization decided that slavery was not just unfortunate, not just a fact of war, but morally wrong. The fight against it began on music in Britain. In 1807, the British Parliament outlawed the slave trade, not slavery itself, that would come later, but the act of buying and transporting human beings. For the next 6 decades, Britain spent roughly 2% of its entire national income patrolling the coast of Africa. British ships intercepted slavers, boarded them, freed their captives, and burned the vessels. In some years, the West Africa Squadron freed more Africans than were being transported by the entire trade. It was the first time in history that a nation used its military power not to expand slavery, but to strangle it. Other nations began to follow. France, Portugal, Spain, eventually the Ottoman Empire. Slowly, the world began turning away from a system it had lived with since the beginning of time. But the largest music and bloodiest reckoning would happen in the United States. By the mid-1800s, America was a nation torn in half. One half industrial, one half agrarian. One half moving away from slavery, one half doubling down on it. The fracture that had been growing since the nation's founding finally exploded in 1861. The U.S. Civil War was a battle for the nation's soul, and at its core stood the Southern music institution of slavery. Southern leaders said it openly in their own declarations of secession. Slavery was the foundation of their society, their economy, their future. 4 years later, the war ended with 620,000 dead, more American dead than in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Roughly 360,000 of those deaths came from the Union side, and the vast majority of those Union soldiers were white. In total, nearly 500,000 white Americans died fighting to preserve the nation and ultimately to abolish slavery. It was the single largest sacrifice any nation had ever made to end its own slave system. When the war ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment was ratified, the United States became one of the first major nations in the world to outlaw slavery completely. Britain had ended the trade. France had abolished it. Some African kingdoms had moved away from it. But the United States ended slavery at the cost of rivers of blood. The ultimate price for a sin that had existed long before the country was born. Yet even then, the world did not move in unison. Slavery in Brazil did not end until 1888, and in parts of the Arabian Peninsula, it persisted well into the 20th century. Saudi Arabia finally abolished slavery by royal decree in November of 1962, almost 100 years after the U.S. abolished it. At the time, estimates suggest there were 20,000 to 30,000 slaves still in the kingdom. In Mauritania, it was not formally abolished until 1981 and not criminalized until 2007. The West did not invent slavery, but it was the first civilization to say clearly and repeatedly that slavery was wrong, and to enforce that belief with ships, laws, diplomacy, and, in the case of America, with the blood of its own sons. For the first time in human history, the oldest institution on Earth finally broke. We've covered thousands of years of human history. Empires rose, collapsed, and vanished into dust. Slavery expanded, adapted, and moved from continent to continent. It was a universal human institution. Yet today, Most people only know one chapter of that story, because somewhere along the way, history stopped being taught and started being curated. Modern education frames the Atlantic slave trade as the beginning of slavery itself, even though it was one of the Azandra's last major systems in a lineage stretching back to the dawn of civilization. Entire chapters of world history, the Arab slave trade, the African slave kingdoms, the indigenous systems in the Americas, are barely mentioned, if at all. And when a story this big gets shrunk into something that's small, the result isn't clarity, it's distortion. And that distortion has consequences. Because the moment you try to talk about these forgotten chapters, the moment you bring up the facts that fall outside the approved narrative, you're labeled a revisionist, a whitewasher, or a racist. Not because what you're saying is false, but because it threatens a story some people depend on. The suffering was real. Families torn apart, identity stripped away, cultures disrupted. Those were genuine wounds. But the idea that trauma remains unchanged for over 150 years isn't history, it's ideology. Every civilization on Earth has endured collapse, invasion, famine, enslavement, or genocide, and they rebuilt. What matters is not what happened then, but what we choose to do now. Because the truth is uncomfortable, no civilization kept its hands clean. If everyone has history stained by slavery, then the narrative of one guilty group and one innocent group collapses. And that collapse is exactly what some people fear. Because once you understand the full story, the modern script doesn't work anymore. You can't divide people with half-truths. You can't weaponize suffering if suffering was universal. You can't pit groups against each other when the entire human race walked through the same fire. So we end with 3 questions. Questions you're not supposed to ask. Why does our education begin the story of slavery in the 1500s instead of at the beginning of time? Why are certain slave systems taught endlessly while others, equal or worse, are buried? And who benefits, music, when a society is raised to see division instead of a common humanity? The answer is simple. Because a divided public is easy to control. And the elites who run the world have always understood one thing. If people ever learned the full truth, they'd stop music fighting each other and start questioning the ones who keep rewriting the story. Let us know your thoughts about the history of slavery music in the comments below. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.